Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for our ninth weekly webinar. That means that we've been doing this COVID thing for more than 9 weeks now. I'm happy to see that everybody here is healthy, and many people that I can see are operating from home, which I'm certainly happy to see. We have a lot to talk about today. The agenda today, we're going to have a legislative update from Tim, which is going to talk about what's happened over the last week and a bit and some information from the province that we've been doing. Then we're going to have actually two panel discussions. The first panel discussion is going to be dealing with zoning and official plan amendments during the COVID crisis, and also the issue of building permits. And the second part of the panel discussion is going to be dealing with workplace leaves. This is kind of looking at returning to work safely, and also I see that Tim just slipped into the agenda that he's going to talk about cybersecurity. I don't think that's actually going to happen because I can control the mute button for him. But we're going to be talking about leaves, about what happens when people come back to work, human rights code, occupational safety act, things like that. Mia's then going to talk about her helpful tips and reminders. And so that's the agenda for today. Now, one thing that I'm excited to announce to everybody today, if you've worked with us much in the past, you know that what we really try to do is take tasks off of your plate rather than give staff a bunch of work they need to do. And so our team has developed a COVID safety training program for return to work. This is going to be a program that you can use to train all of your employees. It will involve 6 separate modules that deal with how to deal with the COVID virus when people are back at work. There will be 6 tests, one at the end of each module. And what you will end up with as senior staff or council is actually certificates for each employee that's gone through this program that you can put in their file, so that if the Ministry of Labor ever comes around asking what you've done to train, Brian's telling me that I'm losing you. Stand by. See if that works better. So it will wind up with certificates for each of the staff people and council people that have gone through this process, so that you can have that in your file. So that will be launched live next week. And we will be giving anybody that's interested further information. I think Brittany will send out some information with respect to this in email afterwards. So that's coming next week for municipalities that are looking at reopening. The next reminder that I heard from Peggy with respect to the E4M subsidy about electronic meetings. E4M has agreed to subsidize the cost of your bylaw, I think $100. And she said that she's only received about 2 applications for that. So if any other municipalities who have used our electronic meeting bylaw have not applied, there's free money for you from to subsidize that cost if you're interested in it. And so with that, I'm going to launch our poll. And we have a poll today dealing with zoning and building permits and building. So I'm going to launch that right now, so that you can have a look at that as we're going. So that takes us to the legislative update, and I'm going to hand this over to Tim, and I'm going to mute him if he utters the word cybersecurity. Over to you, Tim.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I know I've just looking on the screen. I don't know if there may be, I don't know if it's just us, but it seems like the internet's not as strong today as it has been on other days for us. So if I freeze at all, I apologize. But yeah, no, again, I just wanted to echo what Paul said. You know, it's so nice to see everyone again, and we're so happy to be able to continue to do these workshops. Although, of course, these webinars, I should say. Although, you know, of course, I think we're probably all looking forward to the new normal whenever that happens. And on that note, actually, likely you may have seen already, but I suppose the biggest news this week is that the emergency orders have been extended until, and I'm just looking, I've actually got the list of them on my screen here. They've extended to June 9th. The most important ones, there's a laundry list of them that have been extended to June 9th. But the most important things on that list are the emergency orders that include the closure of outdoor playground areas, play structures and equipment, public swimming pools, outdoor water facilities. I know in the Sioux here that may refer to, for example, at Bellevue Park, they have a splash pad. I'm assuming that would be the type of water facility that would be remaining closed under the extension. Bars and restaurants, of course, are still having to remain closed except for takeout and delivery. And the restrictions on social gatherings of more than 5 people and staff redeployment rules are still in place. So that's the big news till June 9th. It seems like there's some concern as well with respect to how long things are going to continue, and part of that concern comes from, unfortunately, as some other news items, not necessarily things that the government have done, but unfortunately, I don't know if everybody saw it last weekend, I should say, there were some news stories floating around about Toronto and some of the parks in that city, and people really crowding in, and there were some interesting pictures that appeared online of crowds of people gathering in some of these parks in Toronto. And I've been reading some things. So there's some doctors who have spoken out about that and how and understanding that people want to get outside. It's turning nice weather, although I hear actually that here in the Sioux we might get frost on Saturday, but for the most part, weather's been improving and people want to get outside. There's going to be frustration. I think everybody's feeling it already, and I think that the reaction from Torontonians in terms of crowding into that park was indicative of the fact that, you know, people are getting a little stir crazy. Summer, we're in Canada, and we've got about 2 months total where it's going to be nice weather. That I might be underestimating, but I think the reality is that people are frustrated. They want to get out. They want to do some of the things they haven't been able to do, and the messaging from healthcare professionals is still, of course, exercise caution. Don't do what Toronto did. That's for individuals, of course. And that wasn't in the gathering spaces in parks. They actually were just seemingly this must have been a relatively small park, and just people gathered in close proximity. So social distancing still very much is something that should be practiced even at parks. And I just wanted to mention that story because, you know, there are some increasing concerns, and that sort of goes to what Paul was talking about to a certain extent last week, which was so the emergency orders have been have been extended, but there are some that have been relaxed. And I think the takeaway is, just because something can be done doesn't mean it necessarily should be done. And I think we talked about that last week, with just because some things were now permitted to reopen, and people were able to do certain things. It doesn't mean that your municipality actually has to necessarily do that reopening. And in some cases, you may find that it's not appropriate, or because your staff are not equipped yet to be able to handle such a reopening. It just at the right time. I just wanted to bring that Toronto story up for everybody, because I think if you saw it, you probably were a little bit shocked, as I was. I know I was, but I know people are feeling the need to try and get back outside, try and get back to the new normal. And it's still, we still need to exercise caution, because there are still new cases. There are still new cases that I'm hearing about every day, where somebody's been contracted the virus. So that's my news update for this week. Again, just to reiterate, emergency orders. The current emergency orders extended till June 9th, and say those cover outdoor playgrounds, play structures, pools, water facilities, bars and restaurants, except for takeout, staff redeployment, etc. So that is my update, and I'll pass things back perhaps to Paul to move us along.
Thanks a lot, Tim. So now we're going to get our first panel discussion. If you have questions during the panel discussion, use the reaction button, and you can put your hand up. Well, you can put your thumb up, or you can clap. If we see one of those, and I'm going to ask Brittany to watch for them, we'll try to turn the floor over to you to ask your question. So what we're talking about here is first zoning amendments, and when I'm talking about that, I'm also referring to official plan amendments and essentially Planning Act issues. So what we know is that the province has extended the limitation periods and essentially all of the administrative timelines for things in court. But they have dealt with Planning Act issues very differently. In fact, they have enacted a specific regulation that deals with the Planning Act time periods. And so if you look at Ontario Regulation 149/20, it's actually pretty confusing. And I've had situations where advisors are giving different advice, and even Municipal Affairs has been giving different advice. And so I'm going to tell you what I think it means. And I think it's actually, although it's written in a fairly confusing manner, and what you actually have to do when you're interpreting it is go through the various sections of the Planning Act that are referred to, but I can summarize it all for you. So the first point is that if a decision was made and a notice of decision was sent out by the municipality before February 26th of 2020, it's okay. That was February 26th is the date that you have to know about most. If the notice of decision is sent out on or after February 26th, it's not valid anymore. And what's going to happen is your secretary or your clerk is going to have to resend out all of the notices on or after for decisions on or after February 26th. After the COVID emergency is terminated, and within the 10 or 15 day period for notices being provided. So under the Act, if you're looking at a minor variance, if you're looking at a zoning bylaw amendment, an OP amendment, or passing an official plan or a zoning bylaw, but I don't know why a municipality would be doing that during the COVID crisis. In any case, there's a 10-day period after the decision or a 15-day period after the decision that the notice has to be sent out to the affected parties. And then there's an appeal period that starts to run after the notices get sent out. And so the notice period, the 10-day period or the 15-day period, stays the same. In other words, if you have to send out your notice within 10 days of the decision, the 10-day notice period stays the same. If you have to send your decision out within 15 days of the decision, that notice period stays the same. But the key difference is that notice periods, the notice has to be sent out after the COVID emergency is terminated. Now, here's where some confusion has come in, because the language says, that the notice has to be sent out within 10 days after the emergency has been terminated or dismissed by the court. It looks like you could send out the notices now and still be in compliance with that requirement. But that's not my opinion, because if we look at the way the Planning Act is written, the decision is what I would call the commencement date for the 10 or 15-day period. And the way the regulation is written, it's changed the commencement period from the day of the decision to the day that the COVID emergency is terminated or dismissed by a court. So it's my opinion that means now the commencement date for sending the notice has to be at the end of the emergency. So it moves the commencement date from the decision date that your committee meets to the date that the province terminates the emergency. So best practice, in my advice, is that if you've been making zoning bylaw amendment changes, if you've had planning committee meetings and decisions are being made, that you diarize those to be sent out within 10 or 15 days of the end of the notice period, and you send them, the end of the emergency, and you send them all out again, even if you've already sent out notices. I don't think you should send out notices of decisions on minor variances or zoning bylaw amendments right now. Don't send them out now, send them out after the termination date. So that then takes us to whether or not you can have Planning Act related meetings. And I think there are going to be two lines on this. One is that province, the legislation of the Planning Act says that the meetings have to be open to the public. The province has given municipalities, by amendment to the Municipal Act, the authority to have our council meetings open to the public electronically. They have not done the same with respect to Planning Act. And so the cautious approach would be to say that the province treated Planning Act meetings differently than council meetings. And so we're not going to have Committee of Adjustment or Planning Act meetings dealing with official plan amendments, zoning bylaw amendments. That's the cautious conservative approach. And I think it's completely defensible. And I think that there will be litigation after the COVID emergency is finished, where somebody takes a run at a big development project that was decided during the COVID period. So if you're the alternative argument, and it's also defensible, is to say, Well, as we know, all meetings have gone online. And so as long as you're having a meeting that is broadcast live and accessible by the public, you could say that our Committee of Adjustment meeting for a minor variance, as an example, was open to the public because it was on Zoom and we published the invitation. There wasn't a password required. Anybody could get in. So that's the second approach. It's the more aggressive approach, and it's also, I think, defensible. I'll tell you that there has been a court decision where the courts have very clearly said, we're moving online. And so it is not appropriate for you to try to delay examinations for discovery or pre-trials or things like that because you as legal counsel or as a client don't want to do it online. The courts are saying we're moving online. So I anticipate that we would be successful in defending a good public meeting that was open but online. But if you want to be cautious and not be the municipality that's fighting that fight, then I think it's also okay to say we're going to put off Planning Act matters until the end of the crisis, because the reality is none of the decisions that your Committee of Adjustments makes right now under the Planning Act can take effect until after the COVID emergency is terminated, after the notice has gone out at the end of that time, and after the appeal period has expired. So there's really not a lot of value in having the meetings and making the decisions now, except that if you're in a busy municipality with a lot of these issues, it would take tasks off the plate of the committee after COVID, because they couldn't be just inundated with applications after that. So does anybody have any questions on that? I'm just having a quick look through, and I see Natasha says, did the dates on the notice of decision change to reflect the date that the emergency has been terminated? No, I don't think so. So if the decision is made on May 29th, then that's the date of the decision. But the notice period has to go out after the COVID emergency is terminated. Maybe that'll happen sometime in June. Maybe it'll happen sometime in July. There's 10 days or 15 days from that, depending on which aspect of the Planning Act we're talking about. And then there's the appeal period that runs after that. And so it's after the appeal period expires that those decisions take effect. So I would not change the date of the decision if you actually had a meeting. And I see that Mary Lynn says that puts a lot of pressure on us because people are waiting to build and hire other people. No, it doesn't. It doesn't put any pressure on us because we don't have the jurisdiction to change the provincial legislation. So the province in Ontario Regulation 149.20 has made this decision. We're a product of provincial legislation, so we have no ability to change that. So there's no pressure on municipalities because we can't change what our bosses tell us we have to do. And that's the message that I would have. And if people are upset about that, then I would certainly refer them to their member of provincial parliament and say, these are the guys that can actually do something about changing this requirement. And I'm happy to give you that information. So I think those are the questions. Does anybody else have a question on zoning issues? And if not, I'm going to pass it over to Nuala to talk about the second part of this panel, which is building permits. Oh, Leah Fraser asks the question. Oh, and Vicky did too. Okay, so Leah, I saw yours first. So just to be clear, if a zoning bylaw amendment application were to be received tomorrow, we should not proceed with the process. I guess that's a decision really for, I would suggest maybe get council to give you direction on that. There's two ways to do it. One is you could proceed, you could put it to the meeting could be held, the decision could be made, and then notice of the decision should be held until after the COVID crisis is over. So that's one way to deal with it. The other way to deal with it would be for council to say, seeing as we're in a COVID crisis and these decisions can't take effect until after the crisis is over, we're not going to have committee meetings until the province reopens by lifting the COVID crisis. Both of those options are available to your municipality. So Leah, I hope that answers your question. Vicky Gertson Cook says zoning amendment application received to allow for farm value added building for food chain. Would this be different? No, there's no exceptions listed in OREG 14920. And so if an application, and Nuala is going to get to this, but if an application is made, even for an essential service, there is no exception in 14920 for the Planning Act decision to take effect until after the emergency is terminated. So it's important to understand what I'm saying here clearly. If an application depends on a zoning bylaw amendment, an official plan amendment, or minor variance, it cannot proceed until after the COVID emergency is terminated. If it does not require a zoning bylaw amendment or an official plan amendment or a minor variance, so in other words, it's already compliant with the legislation, Nuala is going to answer that question. So Vicky, I hope that's most of an answer, and you should get the rest of it shortly. So I'm going to hand it over to Nuala now, and she's going to tell you about building permits. Please go ahead, Nuala, and let us know how the weather is in San Francisco.
I want to make sure I'm unmuted. Paul, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Wonderful to be with you again. Paul has even got his thumbs up icon, so that's how computer savvy Paul is. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, it gives us a great deal of comfort to see such a large number of participants. It lets us know that you guys are healthy and maintaining, which is just fantastic at this time. I feel like we've got a real cohesive group now, our Friday morning group. It does really give us a lot of pleasure knowing that you guys are okay. And it also, again, we are humbled that you choose us as one of the webinars that you make time for every week. Really means a great deal to us, and I hope the information we provide to you is helpful to you. We try and keep it fresh and diverse. As Paul was saying at the beginning, we've devoted a lot of time to the training modules that Brittany is going to speak to you about, I think, via a blast later. But we wanted to have that ready before municipalities start opening fully, so there's time to do this testing. And one of the things that I've been nagging about, I guess, is how do we get the public back? How do we instill that sense of confidence in the public? And of course, you're going to do all of the precautionary things, but having something like, give some thought to the training, because it will allow you to say to your taxpayers, we took it seriously. Our staff was trained, and here's our certificates to prove to you how seriously we took it. And it also is good for one of the things about municipalities that's interesting and makes them such a unique entity to work with is you really have a mixed bag of people in a municipality. People that are very highly educated professionals, and people really, I know when I've been working at cities, there were some literacy problems even with some staff. So to require training for the entire gamut really shows your commitment to making your community safe, making City Hall safe, your arena safe, and the training. I hope you're able to do it. I hope you're allowed to participate in it, because I think it'll really go a long way to instill confidence in your taxpayer, but also in, like Paul was alluding to. Unfortunately, we live in a very litigious time, so it would help in terms of the Ministry of Labor. It'll help in terms of if you know, knock on wood, that there's ever litigation as a result of this COVID, to say these were some of the steps we took. But this morning, I wanted to talk a little bit about building permits. And after May 19th, 2020, the restriction on construction was lifted by the province. So that means effectively all construction projects can go ahead. What I'm seeing across the province is mostly municipalities are continuing to issue building permits remotely, electronically, and that can continue. And ought to have been going on. And also plans examination should be going on, albeit remotely. So for payments, you want payments as much as possible to be contactless, either through checks, electronic transfer, credit card number, to really minimize the amount of time you're spending or your staff is spending face-to-face with the applicant. And I also want to focus a little bit on the Act. The Building Code Act gives certain powers to the chief building official, and only the chief building official or the chief building official's designate. And when you look at the section about issuing building permits, it's what we call in law a positive duty. So that is, the chief building official must issue a building permit unless, that's the way the legislation is written. So unless the project doesn't comply, unless there's something outstanding. So as all of you know, experienced municipal people, as all of you know, very often when people come in for a building permit, something else is needed, a severance, a consent, a rezoning, something of that nature. So if that's the case for your permit applicant, then you're back in Paul's bowl of soup, where you have to wait until those hearings can be heard properly and effective. But you can issue the permit conditional on those things being met. So I think a lot of people will say, forget the permit, because really, it's really not effective until I can get these other pieces in place. I also want to spend a minute talking about building inspectors. And building inspectors are really vital to a municipal operation. Not only do they have to know the building, like for us, even for lawyers, we look at the Building Code Act. And the Building Code Act itself is a very small act. And as far as legislation goes, it's pretty easy to understand. It's the building code that's your problem. It's massive, and that's where you get the electrical code and the plumbing code and all of that. That's very difficult to understand. And it also connects with fire regulations. So building inspectors need to know all of that, and they need to be able to go on site from, I know, for example, in the Sioux, when Walmart was built, we never had anything like that in Sault Ste. Marie. So our building inspectors were really challenged because they'd never inspected, such a building of such caliber. So they really have to stay on their game and stay knowledgeable so that they can do proper inspections. And as many of you know, there's now even personal liability for building inspectors if they make a mistake. So realizing how important they are to our organizations, when we're sending them out to do inspections, it is critical that we look at precautions that can be in place. So some of the precautions would be, I wouldn't have them entering homes where residents are residing at the moment. The exterior, yes, but interior inspections, I would halt at this time. You need to have proper PPE that Mia spoke about a couple of times now, and we have a gentleman that's going to be joining us for a future webinar that his entire focus is on safety and personal protective equipment, and he's going to do a full session for us. It'll be really helpful. But you want your building inspectors certainly to have gloves and masks and proper I don't know why I can't talk on these. I'm very eloquent, except Friday morning, 10 o'clock, the words go. You want them to have proper protective equipment if they're going on to do any sort of inspection. And you really have to tailor it to each project. So encourage people that are building or building permit applicants to deal one-on-one with inspectors via the telephone and tailor how they can actually get the inspection done in these kind of challenging times. But overall, I think issuing building permits is a hopeful sign. I think it's directing us back to, you know, my kids told me to stop saying the new normal, that I'm driving them crazy with it, but it is really going back to the new normal where there will be construction. People really get excited in the spring about construction projects. So I think it's wonderful like that. Keep a hawk's eye on it. Really pay close attention to it. Premier Ford has said, and any city that has experienced opening and closing, like Paris, says the same thing. Keep watching. You can open gradually. Don't be afraid to shut it down if it's going too far in your community. So keep a close eye on the building permit and protect your building inspectors. They're very, very valuable team members. So that's my speech for today on building permits.
Nuala, I think that Brian has a question from Cobalt, and I see that Peggy probably does too from Prince. So we'll let Brian ask the question first, and then hand it over to you. I think I might have to unmute Brian. I have done so. Go ahead, Brian. Good morning.
Which question do you want me to address? The one that I put in the text field, or the one I emailed in?
Not the one you emailed in, because I think Tim's going to deal with that.
Okay.
But I thought you might have a question for Nuala on the building permits.
Actually, I didn't have one on building permits. I simply had one on any idea if there's any funding coming specified for municipalities from the province or the federal government. That was my inquiry. Not related, I don't think, to building permits.
Okay. So I haven't heard anything about funding that's coming for municipalities. And to be really honest with you, Brian, and this is something that I think council should be thinking about in their budgeting process if it's going on right now, I'm really worried that the province's expenditure on the COVID response is going to do the opposite of that, in fact, and probably tighten up expenditures for municipalities. So I think that when we're budgeting, we need to be looking at contingency planning and what happens if the province does something unexpected. I'll tell you, we have a municipality where a large portion of their budget comes from a pipeline assessment. And I'm really worried that the province might do like they did with transmission lines and power dams and change the assessment formula, or even just take that tax for themselves. So definitely stay tuned to that. I'm absolutely worried about that, and I think that council should be planning the rest of the year on the basis that funding from the province is questionable. Nuala, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have a clear answer right now. It is a little bit of a crystal ball. I expect there will be some funding available. I think so. That's been sort of the direction that we've seen every federal and provincial government step up. So I can see that coming, but you always operate as though you're not going to have the money. And like I think we said in one of the earlier sessions, now is such a challenging time. Now's the time to dip into reserves. Now's the time to look at diversifying to the extent you can to have funds available. And I know we were going to talk. We're going to talk later on in the session, and it was part of the poll about one of the things that I think we're going to encourage employers to do moving forward is when this apocalypse is over, to sort of armchair quarterback it, look and see what did we learn from this, and in what area may I save money? And maybe it's real estate. Maybe you don't need as much real estate or office space as you thought you did. We all learned, even people that would say, I'm not very computer savvy. I'm not. They picked it up. They're look at all of us doing Zoom. Look at Paul with his thumbs up icon. Who knew? So I think that it's twofold. I think not only should we be looking at sources of funding, you should also be looking at tightening the belt. Where can we, now that we've learned this from COVID? And you know, and I guess I would say stay tuned. We'll keep you up to. I know money is a number one concern, and even like, I mean, our office is a business. We're reminded of it all the time, regularly, from the managing partners. It's you know, you need money. Money is the oil that keeps the engine going. So we realize how important it is to you, and we'll keep you posted on it.
Okay. So Peggy confirmed with me that she doesn't actually have a question. She just appreciated the information. So we do appreciate that feedback. And I'm going to hand this over to Tim to talk about leaves with respect to employees returning to work. Over to you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So one of the things that we've noticed with municipalities and other employers as well, looking to reopen, looking to bring people back who were working remotely, is that there's not the daycare centers are not open as well, and a lot of people don't have childcare, and you know, they can't get a relative to come by and take care of their children. Their you know, their spouse may be working in a job that they've made a decision that they're not able to take care of the children during, and so the government has put in this new form of leave, and it's a retroactive one, but it's declared emergency leave, and that leave is really designed to overcome this issue that people are legitimately having, where there may be a need to go back to the physical office, but no ability to have care for their children while they're doing so. We all know that schools as well being closed till September is a factor in this as well. So the government said, we're going to create a new form of leave, and it's under the Employment Standards Act. And the leave that they created is called declared emergency leave. And what it does basically, in addition to childcare, it can apply to somebody who is an employee who's under an order made under the Health Protection and Promotion Act. So if they have to quarantine, for example, it can apply to that situation for that 14-day period. So the prerequisites really are, one, the leave applies if during the provincial emergency, which we know is now extended, and one of two things: either the employee has one of these orders placed against them under the Health Protection and Promotion Act, or they're needed to provide care to specified individuals. I use the example of childcare because it's the one that I've seen come up the most frequently. But there's a number of people that are specified. That it can be, actually, the list is really broad. I'll just give you a few examples to show you how broad it is. It can be the employee's brother or sister, for example. It can be a brother-in-law or a sister-in-law. It could be an aunt or uncle, a son-in-law or daughter-in-law, a niece or nephew, or a person. And here's perhaps the most interesting one: a person who considers the employee to be like a family member. And so it's very broad, the list of people who are specified for the purposes of this care provision of the leave. So the classic example, of course, is for example, an employee who's a mother and she decides that she wants to stay, not necessarily wants to, but is needed to not return to the office because there's no childcare available. The daycare that their family uses is closed, and they need to stay home to take care for the children. That's one example. I used mother. It could be father, of course. Another example is a situation where someone's needed to be off from work for the purpose of sometime. Let's say another situation that I've heard of is where an employee needs to, for example, provide medication or something of that nature to a grandparent. And again, it can be a leave. And the reason I mentioned that latter one is because the leave doesn't necessarily have to be taken consecutively. What that means is, for example, in that scenario where the person needs to provide medication to one of these specified people, they may not need to be gone for the whole day. It may be that just half a day they need to be gone for, or that they can't be in the office. And so it may be full days that the leave's taken. It could be part days. It could be every second day. Right? Maybe childcare is able to be provided by a relative, but just every Wednesday or something. So it doesn't have to be taken consecutively, and it can be taken in part days or full days. And so there's a lot of flexibility for an employee who qualifies for this leave to structure it to meet their particular circumstances. During the leave, there's no requirement for an employer to pay an employee during leave. So it's an unpaid leave unless the employer decides to pay the employee. In the event that the employee does work, let's say part of a shift, you still have to pay them for that shift, but you don't have to provide them with pay during the period that they're not performing their duties because of this leave that they've taken. The employee should inform the employer, and if you have individuals, employees at your workplace that want to take this, I'd encourage you to see if you can get it from them in writing. If they're considering taking it, see if they can give you some advance notice of what days they're going to be taking it, what their expectations are, in terms of whether it's full days, part days, consecutive days. The interesting part, though, is even if they don't provide that written notice, unfortunately, they don't lose their right to leave. So while it's hoped that they would be cooperative, give you notice so you can help understand how that leave is going to affect your operations, the employee doesn't lose their right to leave if they fail to tell the employer about it. You can ask them for some evidence of their ability to meet the prerequisites for the leave. Could include, for example, a note from their daycare saying they're not open, or a copy of an order made under the Health Protection and Promotion Act. For example, those are things that you could request. You can't request, for example, if they're caring for a relative, though, you can't request the medical information about the relative's medical condition. So that's something to consider. But you may ask for the relative's name, for example, their relationship, and a statement, for example, that the absence was required because the relative's illness, and the nexus between the illness and the current emergency for COVID. So you could basically, the government's permitted employers to ask for evidence of an employee's meeting the prerequisites to take the leave, but to not go further than that. The length of the leave runs essentially until I suppose the earlier of two things happening. Let's say with respect to the child, the care provision, the current emergency is terminated, or the employee is able to find reasonable access to childcare. Or in the case of a health protection and promotion order, when that order is no longer in effect. So essentially, once the current emergency is over, the employee would no longer be entitled to the leave, I suppose, unless they had an order under the Health Protection and Promotion Act that continued because of their need to quarantine themselves. So that's the sort of drop date is the end of the emergency. Some key things to remember about the leave is that although I say it's unpaid, you can voluntarily choose to pay your employees. And I want to say there may be There may be contractual issues with your employees, depending on the language of your employment contracts, that may entitle them to some pay during this leave. So you want to, if you have employment contracts in place, it's a good idea to review those and understand what, if any, entitlement the employee may have under those to pay during this leave. The employees are also able to continue their participation in benefit plans during the leave. They also continue to accrue vacation, for example, and any other type of seniority related entitlement. So they don't lose those accruals during their period they're on the leave. Basically, I suppose one of the other things to consider is your employees may as well, in deciding whether to pay them during the leave, they may be entitled to other insurance benefits. They might be entitled to the CERB potentially. So just because they're on the leave doesn't mean that they're not necessarily entitled to employment insurance benefits potentially. So that's something to consider. And again, another thing that I want to mention is just you can't, it goes without saying, but discipline and reprisal are not permitted with respect to leave. Obviously, for most of it, I imagine that I don't need to go too much into detail on that, except to say, even for an employee who's considering taking the leave, there's similarly provisions that prevent reprisal. So you can't have a reprisal or discipline for the employee considering taking the leave or for having in fact taken the leave. So, and again, it's a job protected leave, so the employee is permitted to return to their position once the leave terminates. So that's my thoughts on leaves at a high level. I know there's many specific circumstances that people have that come up, and I'm happy to talk maybe offline about some specific circumstances. But I'm looking and I'm trying to see if we've got a question. I'm just looking in the chat here, and I believe we do.
Tim, I'm going to jump in for a second.
Of course, Paul.
When we're thinking about returning to work and the issue of leaves, a couple of best practice tips, particularly if your office is closed and is looking at reopening. One is that it is perfectly permissible for you to have a questionnaire for staff and for any ratepayer who wants to come into the office to determine whether or not they have been exposed to COVID and whether or not you need to take specific steps for that person to facilitate or even prevent them from coming into the workplace. So in other words, it's generally a short questionnaire that would ask the person to confirm in writing that they have not been exposed to a person that they know to have had COVID, that they have not tested positively for COVID, that they have been following the public health guidelines, that they have not traveled. I know that the public health authorities right now are saying have not traveled outside of the district. So questions like that on a short questionnaire are a way that you can protect yourself. And remember that I tell you, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So this is a way to document how you're protecting your staff. The other thing to do with respect to having staff come back to work is a questionnaire for the staff specifically to ask whether they have, whether they are in a high-risk category, whether they have people at home or that they're caring for that are in a high-risk category. Again, you can ask them the questions about whether they've traveled outside of the district, whether they've traveled outside of the country, things like that. So if you're interested in doing something like that, we're happy to help out. The other issue I wanted to talk about is that the leave program is one issue with respect to people being off work. The other issues to keep in mind is that the Human Rights Code continues to require you to accommodate issues of disability and family status up to the point of undue hardship. So even though there may be a leave program in place, there may be a higher duty under that other legislation to protect somebody who's in a high-risk category or has family members in a high-risk category, and make exceptions for them in the workplace. So for instance, if you have somebody who is high risk and they're working remotely, and you decide to bring people back to the office, you may have to accommodate them by allowing them to continue to work remotely, unless you're at the point of what's called undue hardship. So those are some issues that you should be aware of, and we're happy to help with. Vicky asks a question about having some staff nervous about bringing youth students into the workplace even after the emergency order is lifted. They don't want to work with them, we can't provide social distancing, and so on. So Vicky, the answer to this is kind of the same thing that we've talked about previously. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you have to. And one of the things that we do have to follow is the social distancing rules. And equally important is the Occupational Health and Safety Act requires an employer to take all steps reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker. So if you cannot protect workers from exposure, don't bring them back. Make sure you spend an appropriate amount of time designing a workplace safety return to work plan so that you can ensure and you can demonstrate to the Ministry of Labor that you have taken all reasonable steps to protect your workers. So that's going to be training like we're offering, providing PPE, ensuring that they're social distanced, ensuring that they're not going to come into unrestricted contact with ratepayers. You need to think about these things. And it might very well be that you say, we can't bring students back. It might also be that you say, we can only bring a certain number of students back because of the number of vehicles we have or something like that. So it's very important to look at that issue. Now, in light of the time, I'm going to jump over to Mia to give her helpful tips and reminders. And I do see there's some other questions, so we'll see whether they get answered by Mia, and if not, then we'll try to have a look at them. Over to you, Mia.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So what I kind of want to touch on today is the current situation with municipal pandemic response and, you know, what you're kind of dealing with now, and given the reopenings and what's going on, what you may have to deal with in the future with respect to certain things. So uncertain times are continuing as the province starts to open different businesses up and so on. So we've heard a lot about summer camps lately, what patios might look like for restaurants this summer season. You know, budget concerns not only for the upcoming year, but the years to come after that. Childcare services, now that people are heading back to work, and a whole host of other issues. So a lot of municipalities are continuing to deal with a growing list of issues and concerns. And as we're heading into the summer months with the province reopening, in many ways, it's going to be hard to keep people indoors. I think that's just going to be the reality. And so it's important to keep that in mind and be proactive and expect that a lot of people are probably going to be outdoors, but how can we combat any negative effects that may come from that? So always keep in the back of your mind that, you know, review and interpret different actions, ensure that, you know, they're consistent with provincial orders and regulations, that you're still maintaining your COVID response path. And I know we've talked about our COVID response path in the past few weeks. So, you know, that you're consistent with the municipality's goals in how to deal with this, and that you're still thinking about recovery and reopening and ensuring that delivery levels are in the state and shape to provide these services as things start to reopen. So there's lots of challenges that might come from this. And I know I say this every week, but communication is key, especially when it comes to the reopening of municipally run facilities and things like outdoor recreational amenities and so on. So it's difficult because, you know, when I understand that orders come out, they come out quick. The media picks up on them right away. saying this is open and that's open, and then people just flock to these places. But in reality, you as the municipality, if it's a service that, you know, you're providing, you need to be afforded the appropriate response time, you know, to make sure that this happens safely, and to ensure that the health and safety of people visiting areas where municipal services are provided are, you know, properly staffed, are safe. And this might take a few days. So it's important to make a note of that, you know, the province may open things up and you might have to act quickly. So again, this is a communication, not necessarily an issue, but it might be, you know, we have to manage our expectations, and we have to be ready to communicate quickly. Some people have been a little bit caught off guard when it was announced that schools weren't going back. Some people expected this, but it did leave hope with a lot of parents that summer and day camps for July and August, you know, would be running, whether they'd be overnight, and what is eventually going to happen with that. So, you know, municipalities who deliver rent space to organizations that may have summer or day camps need to think about this, because having the camps in July and August, I mean, that's coming quick. So, you know, we still need to hear from the province about if limits are going to increase and what that's going to look like. So that, you know, speaks to a little bit of risk management when it comes to, you know, always be nimble, always be agile, and always be ready to deal with what's coming. You know, as the weather's warming up, the reopenings, restaurants now, you know, I know this was a topic here locally of municipalities figuring out now, you know, what is capacity going to look like for these restaurants? You know, are there going to be outdoor patios? You know, are some streets going to be shut down so patio dining can be extended into the streets and parking spaces, so people can still attend restaurants but maintain social distancing? So we kind of need to get creative and look for solutions if that's the road that we're going to be heading down in these summer months. People want to get outside. People like to sit outside. They don't want to stay home. So we need to ensure that this happens safely. And there may be other implications as well. You know, we have to consider different licenses that may have to be issued, if there's any bylaw amendments that have to happen because of this, and so on. In the midst of all this, there's still the talk about a second wave. Will we see it? We don't necessarily know for sure, but that's what we're being told from health officials, that it's kind of in the future. There's lots of concerns with testing, that it's not at the level the province or the country wants it at. So we have to kind of be concerned of what the future may look like for that as well. Are we, you know, going to have to shift back to all going remotely, shut down services again? This is something that we have to be prepared for. One interesting point I kind of wanted to make, and I've seen this quite a bit, you know, when I'm researching online, and it has to do more with public works, that, you know, researchers are kind of suggesting that testing wastewater may be indications of flare-ups of COVID in certain areas. So that's kind of interesting, and something maybe we should kind of keep in the back of our heads as well, because we don't know, that may be coming down the road as well. So that's all I have for my helpful tips today, and I will turn it back over to Paul.
Thanks very much, Mia. I see that Mayor Othmer, who is right below me on my screen, has a question. So, Mayor Othmer, please go ahead.
Okay, you're right beside me on my screen. That's okay. Museums. We have a couple of museums, and I've heard through the grapevine that some museums are opening by appointment only. Is that the norm, or is that, you know, has the province opened up museums?
I haven't seen anything with respect to museums. That's not to say that that's not happening, but I would like to look into that and okay. See, but I haven't heard anything. I don't know, Paul, Nuala, Tim, if you guys have heard anything about museums, but I haven't.
I have not heard that they've been permitted to open I mean, they were previously closed as a non-essential business. And I haven't seen that has changed. So I would be really hesitant to reopen any municipal type museum in the municipality until we get clarification on that. And then, the idea that they open by appointment so that they keep the numbers down below the 5 people might make some sense. But at this point, I don't think that's permitted yet.
Okay.
Tim, you look like you might have.
No, it's just a local one. I've heard it once. I haven't heard it again, but
Okay.
something come over the radio. So, okay. Thanks again. Thank you very much.
I think there may be some ability for museums to reopen. I'd like to I'd like to have a look, but I know that and I'm wondering if it's similar to retail spaces that have a street, an entrance from the street that have some limitations on their ability to reopen, but there is some ability for them to start doing business again. So I'm thinking that it may be possible for museums to do the same. Again, if we're talking if they meet the same criteria in the sense that they've got an entrance directly from the street as opposed to being located in a mall or another building, it's possible. But that might be something. I don't actually know the answer to that off the top of my head. That's just a thought I had.
Okay, so Your Worship, we'll answer that question next Friday.
Much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we're 8 minutes over time. I'm sorry that we took more of your time than you were originally thinking. Sure glad that everybody was here, and we will see you next week. Have a great weekend, and watch for the information from Brittany about the training seminar that you can offer to your municipality. So just to be clear, that's going to be online. So your employees can do it at any time that is appropriate for your municipality. So thanks very much. Stay safe, and we will talk to you next week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.